Alright, I just watched a video where some guy was tearing into Ron Paul and screaming and cussing, and he was really mad because he said Ron Paul was a liar because Ron Paul said that Social Security is unfunded. And when he started to say this, I was thinking to myself, well, I wonder if he thinks that the fact that there are government bonds backing Social Security, that's what he means by it being funded. Because if that's what he means, then he's an idiot, on top of being a Ron Paul hater. And sure enough, he eventually said, yeah, Social Security is not in fiscal trouble at all. Ron Paul's a liar because it's backed by government bonds. Now, this reminded me of one of my favorite scenes in the classic comedy Dumb and Dumber. If you're not familiar with the movie, Jim Carrey, Jeff Daniels, it's actually a very funny movie. And at one point, they realize that they've been carrying around a suitcase with $1 million in it. And they say, well, we're only going to use it. It's not their money. They realize that. So like, we can't just waste it all. So they decide that they'll only spend it on the bare essentials. And the next scene is them pulling up to a five-star hotel in a Lamborghini, wearing, the most outlandish, expensive clothes you can imagine. And at the end of a movie, the bad guys steal the suitcase with the money, and it breaks open, and instead of money, it's full of all these little pieces of paper that they had scrawled IOUs. And at one point, Jim Carrey takes this little scrap, and it says Lamborghini $275,000 on it. He goes, oh, don't lose that one. That one's important. It comes to mind because that's what a government bond is, basically. You worked. This guy, he looked like he was kind of old, middle-aged at least, and he's been working, and they've been taking money from his check, and they took his money, and then they spent that money. That money's gone, but they gave him an IOU. They gave him a bond. Although not him personally, but they took his money and they bought a bond. They bought a bond from themselves. When the government borrows money, it gives you a bond, and it said, okay, we promise to pay, and then they'll promise to pay interest too. But they didn't create any new money. They certainly didn't create any new wealth. Uh, the money, there's nothing saved. That's money that they're going to tax from people in the future. So all that money he had deducted for his whole lifetime up till now, there's nothing to show for that at all except for the bond, which isn't worth anything. You can't take the bond and buy gas. You can't buy groceries with a bond. You can't refinance your house with a bond. It's not currency. They're going to have to replace it with currency. But they spent the currency that you gave them. They spent it most probably giving it to some corporation that builds weapons. That would be the number one probable destination. And after that, it went to pay other people who they didn't save any money for Social Security. So it's not funded. They have not saved anything for Social Security. They've spent every penny, and so all these people who had money deducted for their whole lifetimes, there's nothing to show for that, except the government's promise that it will pay. But how will it pay? If you retire, then you won't be paying anything else in, and so everybody else will have to pay for your retirement. But then, if the money that's coming deducted out of my salary is to pay for your retirement, who's to pay for my retirement? I mean, this is what people imagine, that Social Security is like a savings account or something of that nature, where they deduct your money and they put it, and they keep it for you because you're too irresponsible. And I remember in the 90s, a lot of the politicians used the term a locked box, that it was safe. I don't believe that there was ever such a thing. I believe that as soon as Social Security happened, they said, well, we have way more money coming in than we have going out for Social Security. So we can use some of the money that's coming in to pay out what needs to be paid out, and the rest of it we don't even need. And so they've spent it a long time ago. It's long gone. The money when he was first got a job in the 60s or 70s and paid Social Security, that money long gone. That probably paid for the Vietnam War to kill the Vietnamese people. It probably paid Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and DuPont and whoever else makes napalm and Agent Orange. When he had his first job back in, I don't know, Sears Roebuck or some factory that hasn't been opened since the 80s, that money that they took from him they spent on war or some nice aircraft carrier that's just basically a huge white elephant that cost hundreds of billions of dollars and just floats around looking impressive. Uh, they took that money and they spent it. And now that it's due, they don't have it. And so they're either going to tax it or they're going to borrow it. And right now, the government is borrowing 2/3 of what it spends. And so what does that mean? It just means it's going to issue more bonds. That's how it, and it's going to go into more debt. It's not going to, bond doesn't, government bonds aren't assets for the government. They're liabilities to the government. I don't know how you could say that because the government has a program with a lot of bonds, that means that it's fully funded. That means that it has tons of liabilities. That's what it means. It would be one thing if they had a huge pile of cash. That would be different, but they don't have that. And if they want to just print the money, I mean, this guy didn't go into whether he thought inflation was a good idea or not. Obviously, it's not a good idea. It's just another wealth transfer on top of this one. And like all the wealth transfers, and the other ironic thing in this guy's video, I should probably link to it, but whatever. You just, every idiot you ever heard, just substitute. Just like all government expenditures, it doesn't go to some orphan or some homeless lady or somebody who's just trying to get ahead, and that little pittance really helps them get through. Government money doesn't go to them. It goes to CEOs at huge companies that manufacture death. That's who it goes to. And when it goes to welfare programs, 2/3 or 3/4 goes to bureaucrats who administer the programs. They go to nice, plush, air-conditioned offices in and around DC. That's where it goes. And to enormous severance packages and retirement deals for bureaucrats who work for 25 years and retire with better benefits than just about 80% of the private sector. So that's where it goes. So don't kid yourself to thinking that the Social Security you pay, even the pittance that doesn't go to killing people, goes to help the poor. When I hear people like that talk, it reaffirms that I'm correct, because if my opposition is that retarded, it was just funny because he was railing against corporations and how evil they are. But where does the government spend its money? For every dollar that goes out in a check to somebody, at least $3 or $4 go to Blackwater, or Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Westinghouse, the people who build the atom bombs. So, no, Social Security is not funded. It's a Ponzi scheme. It isn't viewed that way, but that's what it is. It takes money, all that money that you spend into it. They weren't saving it for you. I love it when people say, "Oh, people are too irresponsible. The government will be responsible." No, the government spent all that money a long time ago. As soon as it got it, it spent it. And right now, as it is, I believe, assuming this isn't a lie as well, but up until the last 1 or 2 years, Social Security was taking in more than it was spending out. And so hypothetically, it could have actually been a savings account. Would have been horribly mismanaged, and it's wrong to take people's money, and they could have done better if they hadn't had it taken. But hypothetically, it could have been a savings account. As of very recently, the last year or two, maybe right now, Social Security is spending more than it's taking in. So it can't possibly, hypothetically even, be a savings account. You can't, if more is going out than is coming in, you can't have savings that way. It's impossible. And even if for the last 80 years they had been saving all that money, which you can never trust government to do ever. But I mean, that would be flying in all the face of all historic knowledge. The aggregate historic knowledge of the world would tell you that that will never happen. But if it had, even if they hadn't spent any of the money that they'd taken in after all these 80 years, and they had a huge pile of hey, even it could be a huge pile of gold. If they're spending more than they're taking in, that pile will disappear, and it's an unsustainable program, and that's where we are right now at best. So government bonds are not assets to the government. They might be assets to you, maybe, if you own a government bond, but you don't own your Social Security account. You don't have a Social Security account. You have a number, but that's just used to track you. That doesn't entitle you to a safe deposit box with a stack of government bonds in it. Uh, government just took the money from Social Security, gave it to itself, and then it issues a receipt, a bond. And that's a liability of the government. They have to spend even more now because they're borrowing it from itself. I mean, it's retarded. So, God, this is